Okay, so now imagine that your firm has first of all decided that yes, it does want to internationalise, and secondly, through the use of Porter's Diamond model, they've also worked out where they would like to internationalise to, and which industries are going to be most competitive in certain countries. Once you've made decisions on those two issues, you can then move on to the third question, or the next question at least, which is the appropriate international strategy that the firm should be employing as part of its overall internationalisation. Now, as you can see here, the international strategy of the firm is basically determined by its emphasis on the following two factors. The first is the need for global integration, which is where there's an emphasis on the strategy being determined by the head office with coordinated resource sharing across the units, namely the subsidiaries and business units that are dispersed across the world. The other opposing dimension is the need for local responses, which is where individual country units need flexibility to choose their own strategies. So they're two very opposing and contrasting ideals. We see that most firms tend to focus on one of those two over the other. Occasionally, a firm may actually choose to try and achieve both at once, but as we'll show over the next few slides, that is increasingly difficult to do. Now, depending on which of those two variables you emphasize will determine which international strategy you are pursuing, and they may be any of the following three, being the global strategy, the transnational strategy, and the multi-domestic strategy. Alright, let's look first at the multi-domestic or localization strategy. Now, as you can see, this is where a firm varies its product offerings and competitive approach from one country to another. Now, this in turn allows it to be quite responsive to differing buyer preferences and market conditions. So when we see different consumer trends and preferences from one market to another, this strategy enables the firms to adapt its product offerings to suit those. And so you don't have this one-size-fits-all approach that we see with the global strategy. In this way, it can be seen as a think, act local, and also act local approach. What we tend to find is most of the multi-domestic firms that employ a multi-domestic strategy have high levels of decision-making decentralization. So high levels of decision-making autonomy and freedom that are given to the subsidiaries so that they're able to adapt and be flexible to these changing and differing consumer demands from one market to another without having to have that single approach across all of them. Now, a good company example here of a firm that employs a multi-domestic strategy is MTV. So what we tend to find is that with our friends at MTV at least, certainly the US, it is an American company, and MTV in the US does have most of the control over the creative and frenetic presentations that we see across MTV. But the sharing of the programming and the content, the programs that are actually shown from one country to another, tend to be quite localized. There isn't a consistency across every single country in which MTV operates. So what we tend to find is that the US loved The Hills. As you can see, RIP. What a great shame that is that that's not on TV anymore. Anyway, the US and a few other countries, I think even Australia unfortunately, did love The Hills. But not every country where MTV operates did show that particular program because it wasn't as appealing in all countries as it was in the US and probably Australia as well. Geordie Shore up in our top right corner is a big hit in the US, the UK rather, not so much in the US where they had Jersey Shore. I almost got that mixed up there. And so that again wasn't shown across all the countries in which MTV operates. Good old Flavor Flav down the bottom, despite his very impressive clock he's got hanging around his neck there, again was not shown in all of the countries in which MTV operates. So this is a good example of a company that, sure, it has some level of control from the head office in the US, but there's certainly a high degree of localization and individual market responsiveness from one country to another. In terms of the key characteristics of the multi-domestic strategy, what we tend to find is that the strategy and operating decisions are very much decentralized to strategic business units, which are most commonly represented as subsidiaries in each country. So going back to that previous example, MTV in Australia shows different television programs to MTV in the US, which in turn shows different programs to MTV in Japan, for example. So we have a higher level of autonomy from each of these different SBUs or subsidiaries across the world, where they have that flexibility and freedom to tailor their product to suit whatever the local tastes and consumer trends demand. And in line with that, the products and services do tend to be tailored to the local markets. Now, unfortunately, with not this type of tailoring. We're talking about the adaptation of products to suit those local consumer demands. The business units in each country tend to be independent, so they don't tend to work together, given the specific nature of each market's preferences and demand trends. We see most of them working independently of one another. The strategy is very much founded and assumes on the basis that markets differ by countries or even by regions potentially, and given that, the focus does tend to be on competition in each market rather than on an international or global basis. As you can imagine from just thinking about some of these things, there are also some inherent limitations with the multi-domestic strategy. The first is that we tend to see, on average, less knowledge sharing for the corporation as a whole. So if you think about it, if each of the different business units and subsidiaries across the world are doing things differently, then they might develop knowledge which is specific to their own part of the world, but it's difficult to transfer that knowledge to another country where the consumer preferences and demands are quite different. So we see a less ability to share the knowledge that the SBUs develop, and it also tends not to allow the development of economies of scale, and therefore ends up being slightly more costly than some of the other international strategies. The reason why this is so, if you can recall when we've talked about economies of scale in the past, these are basically the cost savings that are derived from producing large quantities of a particular or single product or service. So obviously, if everybody is offering slightly different version of the same overall broad product, then that means that you're going to find it more difficult to manufacture or produce that particular product in larger quantities if everyone has a slightly different version of it. And that in turn, as I say, tends to lead to the products being more expensive overall. The opposite of the multi-domestic strategy is the global strategy, and this is where we have a high focus on standardization and global integration with a low focus on local responsiveness. And this is where a company employs the same basic competitive approach in all countries where it operates and sells much the same thing everywhere. So it's not tailored to meet the specific markets here. Everything is pretty much the same irrespective of what country you're selling it in. This is where you as a firm strive to build global brands and coordinate your actions worldwide, with the headquarters having the main control over all the key strategic decisions. And as such, it is very much a think global, act global approach. The company example that we have here is the company Cemex. You may not have heard of them before. They, not surprisingly, make cement, the building material. And so it's a global building materials company that centralizes operations in order to gain scale economies that we talked about just before, as well as other benefits here. So we can see cement is one of those things where it is pretty much the same. It doesn't matter what country you're using it in. People in America want cement for the exact same reason that people in Japan want cement, for the exact same reason that people in Brazil want cement. So it's going to be pretty much a standardized product irrespective of where in the world it is sold. Some of the key characteristics of our global strategy firms: they offer standardized products across country markets, with the competitive strategy being dictated by the head office back in the home country. So it's best facilitated by standardized products that are going to be pretty much used in the same way, and people expect the same thing from them all over the world. They involve strategic and operating decisions that are centralized at the home office, as I say. It involves interdependent, not independent, interdependent this time, strategic business units operating in each country. That is, that they are now, instead of being operating on their own, interdependent means they are now linked. They work together to achieve things like economies of scale, because they're all basically offering the same thing. And the home office attempts to achieve integration across those SBUs adding management complexity. Now, as you can imagine, there are also some disadvantages to this strategy. First of all, you're usually much less responsive to the local market opportunities if you adopt the whole approach of basically saying, well, we're going to offer the same product all over the world. We don't care if there are any even slight differences in terms of what people want from one country to another. It makes it much more difficult for you to achieve those local market opportunities. We also tend to find that it's much more effective in areas where there is a greater level of regional integration. So the North American continent is probably a good example here. Usually what works in the United States, what is popular in the United States, will also be popular in Canada. So you could probably adopt a global strategy, at least across those two countries. But where there isn't such a regional integration, it becomes much more difficult to employ. Alright, our final of the three international strategies is the transnational strategy. And this is where we have a high focus on both global integration and local responsiveness, and as such represents a think global but act local approach, where we, as I say, incorporate elements of both the multi-domestic and the global strategies. It requires both centralization, that is, having that global coordination and control, so having a certain level of interdependence amongst your strategic business units, but also features decentralization, that is, allowing for local flexibility and specific tailoring of products to suit local markets. So we're basically trying to take the best things of both the multi-domestic and global strategies. As you can imagine, this is often quite difficult to achieve. It's hard enough being successful at either just the multi-domestic or global strategy. Trying to do both at the same time can be quite difficult, considering that they're aiming for completely opposite things. What we tend to find is that the current global competitive landscape fosters intense competition and thus pressures to reduce costs for us as a firm. At the same time, information sharing has intensified the desire for specialised, customised, differentiated products. So in most industries these days, there are pressures for both reduced costs through global integration, but also an expectation from customers that you as a company will treat them differently to customers in a foreign market. So we usually often, well, I'll go with often, at this stage as a firm have to try and meet both those standardization and local responsiveness needs. And a good example of a company which has at least relatively successfully pursued this strategy is Starbucks. And if we look at that particular company in China, they might be hideously expensive. They are not that bad when you consider what Victoria's Secret charges per cup. But if we look at them specifically in China, first of all, they standardize their operations in such a way that their brand certainly is very much consistent across the world. Starbucks means the same thing all over the world, and you have a basic understanding of what you're going to get, irrespective of what country you buy their products in. At the same time, though, especially in China, they do decentralize some decision making for local responsiveness, because they've acknowledged that Chinese tastes when it comes to coffee are quite different to those from America. So they have often a similar store layout to what the American stores would have, and they'll have the same branding, and some of the drinks may be the same, but there are also some products in China that are very different to what is offered in the United States. So that reflects both that global integration and local responsiveness at the same time.